Hello dear viewers, today I'm going to discuss passivity in history as an epistemological problem, that is, a problem about knowledge in history and understanding history. But now you might be asking, what do you mean by passivity? And what I mean by passivity is seeing the world from only one actor or effect, and everything is just a reaction to this actor or factor or effect, and not other actors, both individuals and greater entities and systems, having their own agendas and proactively pursuing them independently from this one actor or effect or cause. You see the issue of seeing things as passive repeatedly appearing in history and in political science, especially in international politics. For example, I would argue that currently in international politics, realpolitics professor John Mearsheimer's statements about Russia only reacting to NATO and thus the USA's hegemonic expansion, completely disregarding internal Russian politics and that Russia can be having its own expansionist agendas, together with ignoring all the actors within NATO except the United States, and completely disregarding Ukraine itself in the Ukraine-Russian war and Ukraine's own politics and agendas and wills, is a reflection of this greater issue in present time outside of history. But he is far from alone to have done this mistake historically or to be the only one currently doing it with regard to politics and history, as a focus upon one factor or power, and often the great powers through history, is pretty common. And the reason for this single-minded focus upon the powerful in history and upon an active agent and viewing others as passive and only reactive is that it makes for easier narratives or focuses, as you just have to focus on one factor or actor to regard when you write history or when you try to explain politics, both historically and in the present, as these things mean an easier history to explain. And there is also something to it that more direct and obvious powers often have a greater impact on history than smaller entities, though this is not always the case in history. Most great powers, after all, started as smaller entities, and as people often forget, is that many other smaller entities have existed through history, and that history is not just one actor doing everything and all is a response to it. Smaller entities and individuals can have their own agendas and their own wills, and these can be proactive rather than just a reaction to others or the main powerful entity in a historical period and area. Entities and individuals within states and other political entities that vie for power have led historically to the changing of outer politics within states and kingdoms and empires. And it should also be remembered that many other smaller entities can act against a main entity or factor on the outside and on the inside of states, kingdoms and empires. It is not just conflicts with the larger and more powerful entity being active and everyone reacting to it. There are a lot of smaller conflicts against the main entity and against and between various smaller entities as well. The 30 Years' War is a good example of how chaotic these interactions can be. Also, in conflicts between larger entities, there have been third parties that might take advantage of these conflicts between greater entities. For example, in recent history, the various fascist and other extreme nationalist movements taking control in the political deadlocks of the post-World War I Europe, as the various political factions within the democracies after the First World War often were in deadlock, and thus this could be used to the advantage of various radicals. You also have William the Conqueror taking over England due to the conflicts between Harold Godwinson and Hardrada over the throne of England, following the death of Edward the Confessor. And you have the Crusaders, despite being relatively few in number and far away from home, managed to take territories in the Middle East against political entities in the Middle East that they should have had no business to fight against, but they managed to take land due to the various entities being more concerned with each other and fighting each other than the Crusaders. Furthermore, and my favorite example, the Arab conquests of most of the Middle East was due to the Roman Empire and Sassanid Empire having exhausted each other by previous fighting and wars against each other, leaving them vulnerable to the Arab invasions that came afterwards. If it was simply that it was all about one actor being active and others simply reacting to it, then these things would have not been happening in history or repeatedly in history as they've happened. Though a counter-argument to this is that these entities that were smaller simply reacted to perceived weaknesses in the greater entities. Power, as a common view in history by realist politics historians, is that the powerful always gets their way. Though even here I would say that this is not always the case either. At least not at the start for these entities. As we have, for example, the Achaemenid Persian Empire that was taken over by Alexander the Great. The underdog managed to conquer the greatest empire the earth had seen at that time. We also have the American War of Independence. A small group of rebels managed to defeat the most powerful empire on earth at that time, the British Empire. Though they did get help a lot from France and Spain with financing their rebellion against the English crown. And you also have individuals too that managed to change history despite coming from very modest backgrounds in comparison to where they ended up. Muhammad started his religion not from a position of great power, for example, but from an initially marginalized group. After all, you have to remember that Muhammad had to flee Mecca due to persecution and flee to Medina. And also, even when it seems that an entity is totally dominant, like for example the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, having conquered most of the Middle East, you could still see a lot of counter movements and subversions to the Ottoman authority. Like for example, in the 630s Ottoman invasion of Yemen that ended in complete failure for the Ottomans due to local resistance against the Ottomans by the local Yemeni Arabs that were against the Ottomans' expansion into Yemen. And the danger of viewing various smaller entities as being passive is very prominent when discussing, for example, European colonization, where a view of passivity and combined with noble savage myths applied to colonized people risks reducing their importance and take away their agency and history, as the people of the various European colonies often did have their own politics and agendas, and these agendas and politics usually interacted in various ways that were not always antagonistic towards the colonial powers as the primary enemy. For example, the Ottoman Empire's invasion attempt of Yemen in the 1530s. Some of the groups that fought against the Ottomans in Yemen were actually armed and supported by Portugal, which had colonies on the southern coast of Yemen. Some Yemeni people thought that the Portuguese were the less bad option between them and the Ottomans. And my example here shows the danger of thinking that just because certain people had less of a prominent role in history or had been subjects to other entities, that they had not been up to their own active agendas and had their own reasons and politics before, during and after colonization. Some which might not fit with various often accepted views about how the world was or who is the most powerful in an area. European colonialism as an aggregate included many different groups and individuals with different histories, cultures and priorities when it came to politics that drove active action, and these were not just passive people to colonialism but had their own agendas and had their own priorities. And it's really much an illusion of control and easy understanding in the face of an enormously complexity that existed in European colonialism all around the world, when we ignore how active local peoples were in their interactions with the colonial powers, aiding them, using them, and or resisting them due to their own local active agendas, often in conflict with other locals. Though it should be said that many of these arguments about viewing only the colonial powers as the active parts has to do with simplicity, argumentative simplicity, that is often favored as it can make for cleaner arguments, yet it often overlooks a lot of the complexity that exists in history, as I have mentioned, and can give a one-sided view of history and politics throughout human history, as being the result of active agents and passive reactionary agents. Because human history, such as European colonialism and other aspects of human history, is not one of active and passive responders, but of a multitude of factors, entities and individuals interacting with each other in various ways, often with their own active agendas and reasons for doing so. And me highlighting this is not something unique or new, as Max Weber, the father of sociology and also an historian, during the late 19th century, early 20th century, stressed the fact that multiple factors, entities, and people are involved in creating history, through multiple actors doing multiple interactions. Though, of course, certain interactions and certain factors will be more important than others, and you will have issues of relevancy and considerations of relevancy and choice of subjects to discuss when trying to make history. So certain entities or actors might not be mentioned, and instead a focus will be put on a few actors, which will make it seem like these actors were the only active actors during this time, even if this was not the intention of the historian that wrote the history. It just became like that due to the focus of the history. But the goal of this video was to explain to you, my viewers, that just because it seems like other actors were passive, they most likely were not passive, in fact. As people tend to have active agendas. And have it in mind when you read history or when you hear someone discuss history and it looks like there is only one active agent in this history. Ask yourself which other active actors could be present in this history but have not been presented as active agents or as an active factor. My advice to you, my viewers, is to always ask this question with regards to history. Just like my advice to you is also to ask me questions about this video and to give other comments and to like my video. Thank you. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.